"Melissa, we've placed you at table 19, near the kitchen," Eleanor Harrington said, her tone polite but firm, her eyes cool with judgment as she gestured at the seating chart in the pristine bridal boutique. I didn't react, though my stomach tightened. Table 19. Out of sight. Away from my daughter. I glanced at her. I nodded, refusing to make a scene. But inside, I knew this wasn't just about seating. It was about status, image, and erasure. My name is Melissa Warner. I'm 48, a single mom from Chicago. I raised my daughter Audrey alone. No support, no shortcuts. Just grit and love. When she got engaged to Andrew Harrington, I thought I was gaining a family. Instead, I was being written out. Stay with me to see how a mother's quiet dignity outshined generations of money, and how I showed them exactly who just a secretary really is. At 22, I was pregnant, abandoned, and alone in a cramped Chicago apartment with nothing but a high school diploma and a second-hand crib. Audrey's father had vanished before the ultrasound even revealed her heartbeat. There was no family safety net, no trust fund, no backup plan. Just me. I took the first job I could find, front desk assistant at Westbrook Communications. It paid just enough to keep the lights on and formula in the cabinet. But I was determined. I arrived early, stayed late, volunteered for everything. I learned fast how to anticipate a CEO's needs, how to prepare boardroom briefings, how to stay calm under pressure. After 5 years, I was promoted to executive assistant to Harold Westbrook himself, a man whose schedule ran the city's telecom empire. I held that role for 15 years. Every paycheck went to building a future for Audrey. I packed lunches at dawn, read college brochures at midnight, and budgeted every dollar to afford her prep school tuition. When she got into Northwestern for pre-med, I cried in the hallway at work, then worked overtime to make sure she never had to worry about books or rent. She grew into a bright, compassionate woman who never forgot where she came from. When she met Andrew Harrington during her residency, I was thrilled. He was kind, brilliant, and clearly adored her. I thought she'd found someone who would cherish her the way she deserved. But then I met his parents. Eleanor and Walter Harrington were old male Chicago Lakeshore Drive penthouse, private art collections, dinner parties filled with senators and CEOs. From the start, Eleanor's attention slid past me like I was furniture. "And what does your mother do, dear?" she asked Audrey at our first meeting, not even making eye contact. "She's the executive assistant to the CEO of Westbrook Communications," Audrey answered proudly. "Secretary," Eleanor said with a tight smile. "How? Reliable?" I laughed it off, attributing it to nerves or generational differences. But the jabs kept coming. "I assume you'll need help with formal wear for the rehearsal dinner," she'd say. Or, "We've revised the invitation list, trimmed down some of Audrey's guests for space." The guests she cut were my family, my Aunt Meredith, people who'd held Audrey as a baby. When I brought it up to Audrey, she brushed it off. "They're just a little old-fashioned. They'll come around once they get to know you." But they didn't want to know me. They wanted to replace me. They saw Audrey's rise as their success, her background as a blemish to erase. I told myself it was just one day, one wedding. I'd swallow my pride for Audrey's happiness, but it didn't stop. At every planning meeting, I was left out of emails, seated at the edge, treated like an obligation. And with every slight, every veiled insult disguised as tradition, I realized the truth. The Harringtons weren't just indifferent, and they thought I'd stay silent. The cracks began quietly, like soft knocks no one else could hear. The wedding planner had sent out a revised email chain, yet somehow, I wasn't included. Again. I found out about changes only when Audrey mentioned them in passing, assuming I was in the loop. I smiled and nodded, not wanting to distract her with my growing concerns. Then came the family portraits. A week before the wedding, the schedule comprised Audrey with Andrew with his parents, the Harrington family with extended relatives, but nowhere was there a slot for Audrey with her mother. I flagged it to the coordinator. She looked embarrassed and said, "Oh, Mrs. Harrington said there wouldn't be time." The rehearsal dinner at the Chicago Yacht Club should have been a moment of pride. I'd bought a simple but elegant black dress, more than I could afford, and arrived early. As I searched for my name card, it wasn't with Audrey's family. It was at a table tucked by the exit, next to the wedding planner and the photographer. Staff, I kept my composure, sat down, and tried to smile through it. My daughter looked beautiful that night, glowing and distracted, torn in 1,000 directions. She barely noticed where they'd put me. Later that evening, my phone buzzed under the table. It was Audrey. "Mom, the Harringtons cut Aunt Diane and Cousin Paige from the guest list. I didn't know. I'm so sorry." I stared at the message, my fingers tightening around the stem of my wine glass. I hadn't imagined it. They were excising me, bit by bit. My family, my presence, my place. Eleanor's words echoed like tiny slaps. "The head table is reserved for immediate family and distinguished guests," she'd said earlier that week, her tone frosted with condescension. "You'll be at table 19, close to the kitchen, but not too noisy." When I raised an eyebrow, she added, "We want everyone to feel comfortable where they belong." Then, when Audrey wasn't looking, she added, "Do let me know if you need help finding something suitable for the black tie dinner. I know it's not your usual wardrobe." I smiled politely, like I always did, while inside something started to shift. My job, my clothes, my apartment. My very existence constantly deemed not good enough by a woman who had never once asked what I'd overcome to get here. They didn't see my sacrifice, only my salary. They saw my title, not my impact, and somehow, they believed that by seating me at the edge of the room, far from my daughter, they could rewrite who mattered most in her life. But what they didn't know, what Eleanor couldn't possibly understand, was that the harder someone tries to erase you, the sharper your outline becomes. I wasn't just a secretary. I was the reason Audrey stood in that room at all. And quietly, in that moment, the moment I arrived at the wedding reception and saw my name card at table 19, again tucked near the kitchen, behind a column, beside the DJ booth, I knew Eleanor had made her final move. The table was filled with peripheral guests, a music consultant, the event photography's assistant, and someone from the overlooked, for the unwanted, for people whose presence didn't matter. I smoothed my dress, sat down gracefully, and began to take mental notes. If Eleanor wanted me silent and sidelined, I would grant her the first, never the second. What she didn't know, what she could never have imagined, was who else would walk through those doors that night. The first to approach was Joseph Brennan, CEO of Meridian Healthcare, one of the largest systems in the Midwest. He spotted me before I saw him, and the warmth in his smile was unmistakable. "Melissa Warner," he said, extending a hand, still keeping Harold Westbrook's calendar running like a Swiss watch. We chatted briefly about his recent contract renewals, ones I'd personally helped negotiate. As we talked, I noticed eyes shifting in our direction. Eleanor, too, had clocked him. Her narrowed gaze tracked every word exchanged between us, and I saw her whispering quickly to Walter across the room. Then came Catherine Prentice, CFO of Allied Technologies, followed by her husband, State Senator William Prentice. They recognized me instantly. "Melissa, I had no idea your daughter was the bride," Catherine said warmly. "Audrey must take after you." Within the hour, the governor's chief of staff stopped by to say hello. Then Congressman David Holloway arrived, greeting me like an old friend. "Melissa, I was hoping I'd catch you here. I need your insight on that infrastructure brief we discussed," he said, completely oblivious to the social snub surrounding my seat. I glanced up and met Eleanor's eyes across the room. Her expression had shifted from smug satisfaction to confused calculation. She hadn't just misjudged me. She had catastrophically underestimated the reach and reputation of the woman she had tried to diminish. What she failed to see, through her designer lenses and inheritance, was that, in the world I operate in, behind the scenes, inside the boardrooms, quietly running multi-million-dollar operations, respect is earned, not flaunted. My title may be executive assistant, but my influence spans industries. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to fight for a better seat. All I had to do was be exactly who I am, in the right room, with the right people, and Eleanor's carefully curated narrative began to crumble on its own. She had given me table 19, but I was about to turn it into the most powerful seat in the building. As the reception progressed, the energy in the room began to shift. but not toward the glittering head table where Eleanor and Walter Harrington sat flanked by hospital board members and carefully chosen dignitaries. No, the attention had begun migrating. Joseph Brennan's presence had already caused a stir, but as Senator Prentice and Catherine joined us, then lingered to speak warmly about Audrey's career and how proud I must be, a ripple effect began. Guests who hadn't thought twice about table 19 earlier were now making their way over with polite smiles and half-curious, half-calculating eyes. Soon after, the governor's chief of staff dropped by, followed by Congressman David Holloway, who waved off the formalities and settled into the empty seat beside me like we were at a working lunch. Eleanor noticed it all. I saw her trying to keep her expression neutral, her glass raised in a permanent pose of detached grace. But I'd spent years in boardrooms, reading facial micro-reactions. Her told me everything. The shift in power had begun and she knew it. From across the room, I saw Walter leaning in, whispering something into her ear. Her posture stiffened, and her eyes narrowed on me with fresh urgency. I was no longer just the woman she had dismissed. I had become the person commanding the most influential table in the room. And worse, I hadn't said a single boastful word. Instead, I let others speak for me. Congressman Holloway loudly praised Audrey's accomplishments and said, "No surprise there. Melissa runs one of the most complex calendars in Washington. Anyone who can keep Harold Westbrook on schedule should run the country." Laughter followed. Catherine added, "I'd argue Melissa is the reason most of Harold's deals actually close." No one disagreed. Audrey floated over in her gown, her eyes scanning the table, her brow creased with curiosity. "Mom," she whispered as she leaned in. "What's going on? People keep telling me you're the reason they came." Her voice held wonder, confusion, and a twinge of realization. I smiled gently. "You remember how I always said I support Harold behind the scenes? These are the people I've worked with for years." "Why didn't you ever say?" she began. "You didn't need to know," I replied softly. "Because what matters most to me is who you are, not who I am." Audrey turned, taking in the scene, how heads turned when I spoke, how Harold's wife Victoria had just kissed me on both cheeks before announcing to a nearby guest that I was the real backbone of Westbrook Communications. My daughter's eyes flickered with something new. Not pity, not pride, but clarity. Meanwhile, Eleanor made her move. She approached our table with a practiced smile and extended a hand toward Congressman Holloway. "What a pleasure to meet you. I don't believe we've been introduced. I'm Eleanor Harrington, the groom's mother." He returned the handshake but didn't rise. "Of course. We were just talking about Melissa's insights on infrastructure rollout." His emphasis was deliberate. Eleanor's lips twitched. She turned to me. "Melissa, it seems you've drawn quite the crowd. We really must find time to talk." Her tone was syrupy, but her eyes were sharp. I looked at her calmly. "We're all quite comfortable here, thank you." What she couldn't say aloud, but what I knew she realized, was that her attempt to bury me in a back corner had backfired catastrophically. Because in trying to erase me, she had accidentally exposed me. And once the room saw me clearly, there was no going back. When the wedding coordinator announced it was time for the mother's speeches, a hush swept over the room. The crowd, now deeply aware of the strange gravity around table 19, turned their attention to the podium. Eleanor Harrington moved with graceful precision, her sequined gown catching the light, her expression poised. She took the microphone with a soft smile and began. Her words were perfectly crafted, layered with practiced warmth. She spoke of Audrey and Andrew's love, of traditions and family, of how proud she was to welcome Audrey into their circle. She referenced their shared values and vision, dropping subtle cues about legacy and refinement. Her speech was polite, even charming to the untrained ear, but for those who'd watched the evening unfold, it was steeped in quiet revisionism. She offered no acknowledgement of the woman who raised Audrey alone, who sat a few tables away, surrounded by Chicago's most influential leaders. Her final line, "We look forward to building a future together, as one united family," landed like a quiet erasure. The room clapped, but the applause was light, polite. A few exchanged glances. Eleanor returned to her seat, her eyes flicking to me as if daring me to match her performance. I stood, slowly, smoothed my navy gown, and approached the microphone. The room stilled again, this time with heightened expectation. I scanned the crowd, not seeking validation, just connection. Then I spoke. 26 years ago, I began. I found myself pregnant, alone, and with no college degree. I didn't come from wealth. I didn't come from legacy. What I did have was a baby on the way and a determination to give her everything she deserved. All eyes stayed on me. I started as an entry-level assistant at Westbrook Communications. I took night classes. I worked weekends. I learned everything I could. And eventually, I became the executive assistant to Harold Westbrook, CEO of one of the largest telecommunications firms in the country. A few heads turned. Some guests who hadn't heard the earlier whispers looked visibly surprised. I've helped manage international deals, worked through corporate crises, scheduled meetings between heads of state and CEOs, and, most importantly, raised a daughter who is now a physician, a wife, and one of the finest people I know. I looked toward Audrey, who had brought her hands to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Wiped her whispers tonight about how I'm just a secretary, about how my title somehow defines my worth. And I want to say this clearly for every woman who's ever been underestimated because of what she does, instead of who she is. There is no such thing as just anything. I paused, the silence vibrating with tension. Being a secretary paid for prep school. It paid for textbooks, braces, piano lessons, and late-night pizzas during exam weeks. It paid for Audrey's medical school. And it taught her what perseverance looks like. It taught her that your job title is not your identity. Your worth is measured by your effort, your kindness, and your integrity. Someone began clapping. Then another. Within seconds, the room erupted in applause, real, unrestrained, rising to a standing ovation. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't used bitterness. But the truth of my words carried weight. I glanced toward Eleanor and Walter. Eleanor's smile had frozen, eyes wide, with a mixture of disbelief and calculation. Walter looked down at his hands, uncomfortable. Audrey ran to the stage and threw her arms around me, sobbing openly. "Mom," she whispered, "I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I should have seen it sooner." I held her tightly, brushing the hair from her face. "You saw it now," I said softly. "That's what matters." The emotional power dynamic had shifted, not through confrontation, but through quiet truth. The room, once ruled by old money and hushed judgment, now felt open, different, real. As I returned to my seat, I passed Eleanor. She stood, rigid, her polite facade cracking just enough to show the panic underneath. Her world, the one built on appearances, power, and carefully controlled narratives, had been challenged, and not by scandal or outrage, but by something far more potent, undeniable, earned respect. The rest of the evening would play out, but the moment had already arrived. And everyone knew it. In the weeks following the wedding, the ripples of that night continued to move quietly but powerfully through Chicago's elite social circles. Melissa didn't boast. She didn't share stories or send follow-ups. She simply returned to her desk at Westbrook Communications, managing Harold's schedule with the same precision and grace she always had. But those who were present at the reception remembered, and they talked. Within a month, Catherine Prentice called Melissa during a quiet moment between board meetings. "Thought you'd like to know," she said. "Eleanor's been asked to step down from the Art Institute's fundraising committee. Quietly, of course, but the message is loud." Not long after, Joseph Brennan brought it up over breakfast. Walter didn't get the hospital board chairmanship. He said over coffee at the Peninsula Hotel. It was supposed to be a formality, but too many questions were raised after the wedding. People were reminded that character still matters. Melissa nodded with a quiet smile. She didn't need more than that. She hadn't taken anything from the Harringtons. They had simply undone themselves in front of the very people they most wanted to impress. Back at home, Audrey and Andrew returned from their honeymoon glowing with joy, but their choices after the wedding said even more. "We found a house," Audrey told her mother one afternoon over tea. "It's near the hospital, and near you." Melissa looked at her daughter, her heart swelling. "Not the Harrington neighborhood?" she asked gently. Andrew shook his head. "We want a fresh start, on our terms." The Harringtons hadn't taken the shift in power well. A week later, a luxury gift box arrived at Melissa's apartment. An expensive Hermes scarf, carefully wrapped, with a card in Eleanor's flowing script, "To Melissa, with admiration and appreciation for all that you do." It was a transparent attempt at social reconciliation, but laced with the scent of strategy. Melissa folded the scarf neatly, placed it in her drawer, and replied with a polite thank you note. "Thank you for the lovely gesture. I'll be sure to wear it on a meaningful occasion." The next time they saw each other was at Audrey and Andrew's first dinner party as a married couple. Eleanor arrived with a carefully chosen bottle of wine and an exaggerated warmth in her tone. "Melissa, darling, it's so good to see you. You've always been such a vital part of this family." Melissa smiled and thanked her, offering her a glass without a trace of resentment. Her tone was warm, her body language open. Walter attempted small talk about the latest Westbrook initiative, clearly having done his homework. Melissa responded with gracious civility, steering the conversation effortlessly. She didn't need to assert her worth. Everyone already knew. The shift had taken root. From that day forward, Melissa's place wasn't debated, negotiated, or ignored. It was acknowledged. Quietly. Permanently. She had never raised her voice, never needed to trade insults or demand space. She simply showed up, stood tall, and let the truth speak for itself. In the end, the Harringtons lost more than faith. They lost the illusion that pedigree could protect them from the consequences of condescension. And Melissa? She gained exactly what she'd always earned: respect, presence, and her rightful place in every room. Melissa returned to Westbrook Communications the Monday after the wedding, just as she always had. Calm, early, organized. Her inbox was full, her planner packed, and Harold had already left a post-it note on her desk that read, "Welcome back, legend." She smiled, peeled it off, and tucked it into her drawer. It wasn't just a compliment. It was recognition. Nothing about her job had changed on paper. She was still the executive assistant to the CEO. She still managed Harold's meetings, briefings, travel schedules, and crisis logistics. But the way people looked at her had shifted. There was a new energy in the office, a quiet buzz of acknowledgement. Interns who had once passed her desk with hesitation now stopped to ask questions. Younger women in the company began requesting mentorship meetings. "You've been here through everything," one of them said. "How do you stay so steady?" Melissa's advice was always practical, but layered with wisdom that came from decades of invisible labor. In the weeks that followed, invitations arrived. Not as the event planner, but as a guest of honor. Industry panels on executive leadership wanted her perspective. A regional business journal requested a profile. Harold had even floated the idea of her representing Westbrook at a Women in Tech summit in DC. She had once booked those tickets for others. Now they were booking her. But what struck Melissa most wasn't the shift in external attention. It was the change in how she felt inside. For years, she had accepted being overlooked as part of the job. She thought being indispensable meant being invisible. Now, she understood that being the backbone didn't mean she had to vanish into the structure. She could take up space and still be the same steady, unshakable force behind the scenes. She still got home at 7:15 and still meal prepped on Sundays, still reminded Audrey to take her vitamins and texted her good luck on shift change days. But there was more lightness in her step, a confidence that ran deeper than pride. It was rooted in knowing she had earned her place, not through title or inheritance, but through work, compassion, and resilience. Melissa didn't need revenge. She didn't crave applause. What she had built, brick by brick, year by year, was far more valuable than anyone's approval. Her daughter saw it. Her colleagues saw it. Even the Harringtons, in their own silent way, saw it now. She had never changed for them, and that was her power. Now, finally, the world had caught up to what Melissa Warner always knew. Her worth had never been tied to a title. It had been written, quietly, in everything she touched. 6 months after Audrey's wedding, a crisp ivory envelope landed on Melissa's desk. Inside was an invitation to the annual Hospital Board Gala, the most exclusive healthcare event in Chicago. But it wasn't just the embossed lettering or the engraved crest that made her pause. "Mrs. Warner, you'll be seated at the head table as requested." Melissa smiled, her fingers grazing the edges of the card. She hadn't requested it. Someone else had. But the message was clear. The room now saw her. She remembered table 19, the dim lighting, the clatter of service doors, the dismissive smiles and polite disregard. But she also remembered what followed, the ripple that spread when people realized the woman seated by the kitchen had built half the networks they relied on. Her voice wasn't loud, but it had reach. And now, it had weight. That night at the gala, Melissa entered the ballroom in the same quiet elegance she always carried. But this time, eyes turned with respect, not confusion. Eleanor was there too, a few tables back, smiling tightly, her position a shadow of what it had been. Melissa took her seat at the center of the head table, the same way she had taken her place in the world, calm, confident, and without apology. They tried to hide her. But they'd forgotten Melissa Warner had never needed permission to belong. They tried to keep her out of the spotlight. But next time, she wouldn't just be at the table. She'd be setting it